The entire auditorium fell silent after the professor wrote 6 lines of symbols across the giant screen. Hundreds of students stared at the impossible equation. Some whispered. Some laughed nervously. Others immediately lowered their eyes, afraid of being called on. Then the professor smiled and made a shocking announcement. If anyone in this room can solve this problem in the next 30 minutes, I will personally pay them $50,000. The room exploded with murmurs. $50,000. For most students, it sounded like a fantasy. But the professor wasn't joking. He was famous for creating mathematical challenges that even graduate researchers struggled to solve. He folded his arms confidently. However, he added, I have taught this challenge in universities around the world. So far, nobody has solved it. The confidence in his voice sounded almost like a challenge. Rows of students immediately began scribbling calculations. Laptops opened. Pens moved furiously. Near the back of the auditorium sat a man who looked completely out of place. His shirt was faded. His shoes were worn. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes as if sleep had become a luxury years ago. Most people assumed he was maintenance staff because he looked far older than the average student. His name was Daniel Carter. 36 years old. Single father. Part-time delivery driver. Part-time warehouse worker. And secretly attending night classes whenever he could afford them. Nobody paid attention to him. Nobody except his 6-year-old daughter Sophie, who sat beside him coloring in a small notebook because Daniel couldn't afford a babysitter. Daddy, she whispered. Yes? Everyone looked scared. Daniel smiled. Maybe they are. Are you scared? He glanced toward the equation. No. Sophie grinned. Good. Then she returned to her drawing. The professor began walking through the audience. 20 minutes passed. Students filled pages with failed calculations. 10 minutes later, frustration spread across the room. Even the brightest minds seemed stuck. The professor checked his watch. 5 minutes remaining. A few students groaned. Some already gave up. The professor smiled wider. Exactly as he expected. Then something happened. A hand slowly rose from the back row. At first nobody noticed. Then several students turned around. The hand belonged to Daniel. The tired single father. The man many had mistaken for a janitor. The professor stared. You. Daniel nodded. I believe I found the answer. Laughter erupted instantly. A group of students exchanged amused looks. One young man near the front couldn't help himself. You found the answer? We've got national scholarship winners in here. More laughter followed. Daniel didn't react. The professor studied him carefully. Are you enrolled in this university? Yes. What department? Technically mathematics. Technically? I only take 1 course per semester. More laughter. The professor crossed his arms. Very well. Come solve it. The auditorium watched as Daniel walked toward the stage. His old shoes echoed against the floor. Every step seemed heavier than the last. Not because he doubted himself. Because he knew what happened whenever people judged appearances. They laughed first. Then came the surprise. Daniel picked up the marker. He stared at the equation. The professor stood nearby waiting for him to fail. The audience waited too. Daniel began writing. 1 line. Then another. Then another. The laughter slowly faded. The room grew quieter. Students began leaning forward. The professor's smile disappeared. Daniel wasn't guessing. He wasn't experimenting. He was moving with absolute certainty. Like someone retracing a path he already knew. 5 minutes later he stepped back. The board was covered with calculations. The final answer sat at the bottom. The auditorium remained silent. The professor stared. 1 minute passed. Then another. His face slowly changed. Confidence became confusion. Confusion became disbelief. Disbelief became shock. Finally he grabbed the marker and began checking each step. The audience watched nervously. Nobody spoke. 10 long minutes passed. Then the professor dropped the marker. The sound echoed through the room. No. The words slipped from his mouth. Daniel remained calm. The professor checked again. And again. And again. Each verification led to the same conclusion. The solution was correct. Perfectly correct. The auditorium exploded. Students stood from their seats. Some shouted. Others stared at Daniel as if he had performed magic. The professor looked speechless. How? Daniel shrugged. I solved a similar structure years ago. Years ago? Yes. Where? Daniel hesitated. A strange sadness appeared in his eyes. Then he answered. At home. The professor frowned. At home? Daniel nodded. After my wife died. The room immediately fell silent. Daniel looked towards Sophie. She was still coloring. Still smiling. Still innocent. She was pregnant when a drunk driver hit her car. The audience froze. My daughter survived. He pointed towards Sophie. She didn't. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Daniel continued quietly. I couldn't sleep for years afterward. Mathematics became the only thing that stopped my mind from collapsing. The room listened. Every night after putting Sophie to bed, I'd spend hours solving problems. The professor stared. Hours became years. Daniel smiled faintly. Eventually mathematics became easier than grief. Silence filled the auditorium. The professor looked down. For the first time all evening he seemed humbled. You solved one of the most difficult challenges I've ever created. Daniel shook his head. No. The professor frowned. What do you mean? Daniel pointed toward the board. I solved one problem. Then he looked towards Sophie. Raising her alone was the difficult one. Several students wiped tears from their eyes. Even the professor looked emotional. But the surprises weren't finished. The professor stepped closer. Who taught you? Daniel laughed softly. Nobody. You taught yourself advanced mathematics? Yes. The professor looked stunned. How far did you study formally? Daniel hesitated. High school. The entire auditorium gasped. The professor stared as if he hadn't heard correctly. High school? Daniel nodded. I had a scholarship once. What happened? My father got sick. The room listened carefully. I dropped out to support my family. The professor looked speechless. And after that? Life. A single word. Yet everyone understood. Bills. Work. Responsibility. Sacrifice. Dreams postponed year after year. The professor slowly turned toward the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said quietly, you are witnessing something extraordinary. Then he faced Daniel again. Would you allow me to ask one more question? Daniel nodded. What is your IQ? Daniel laughed. I have no idea. The professor smiled. I think we should find out. The audience laughed softly. For the first time all evening the tension eased. But then another voice interrupted. An elderly man stood from the front row. Nobody had noticed him earlier. He had attended quietly without speaking. The university president. He walked onto the stage. His eyes never left Daniel. What is your full name? Daniel Carter. The president froze. Carter? Yes. The elderly man's expression changed instantly. Your father wasn't Michael Carter, was he? Daniel looked surprised. Yes. The president took a sharp breath. I knew him. The room became silent again. He was one of the most gifted mathematicians I've ever met. Daniel blinked. What? The president nodded. Your father solved a problem in this very university 30 years ago that researchers had struggled with for months. Daniel looked stunned. My father never told me. The president smiled sadly. He turned down every offer because he wanted to focus on raising his family. Daniel felt his throat tighten. The audience watched quietly. Your father sacrificed his career for the people he loved. The president's voice softened. Looks like his son inherited more than his intelligence. Daniel couldn't speak. For years he had believed his life was filled only with missed opportunities. Now he discovered he was walking a path his father once walked. The same university. The same stage. The same impossible problem. Tears filled his eyes. For the first time in years he missed his father almost as much as he missed his wife. Then Sophie suddenly ran onto the stage. Daddy! The audience laughed. She wrapped her arms around his leg. Did you win? Daniel smiled. Yes. How much? $50,000. Sophie's eyes widened. That's a lot of ice cream. The entire auditorium burst into laughter. Even the professor laughed so hard he nearly bent over. Sophie looked confused. What? Daniel knelt beside her. What would you buy? She thought carefully. Then gave an answer nobody expected. A bigger house. Daniel froze. So you can have your own room, she continued. The laughter vanished. Daniel felt tears forming again. Because Sophie had never asked for toys. Never asked for expensive gifts. Never complained about sharing a tiny apartment. Her first wish was for him. The professor quietly wiped his eyes. The president looked away. Several students openly cried. At that moment, everyone understood something. The greatest achievement wasn't solving the equation. It wasn't the $50,000. It wasn't the standing ovation. It was surviving years of hardship without losing kindness. The university president stepped forward. I have an announcement. The audience became quiet. Effective immediately, Daniel Carter is being offered a full academic scholarship. Thunderous applause erupted. Daniel stared in disbelief. The president continued. Additionally, we are offering housing assistance and a research position. The audience erupted again. Daniel couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Couldn't process what was happening. Years of struggle. Years of sacrifice. Years of exhaustion. And suddenly everything was changing. Sophie tugged his sleeve. Daddy? Yes? Does this mean we're okay now? Daniel looked at her. Then around the auditorium. Then at the equation that had changed everything. Finally he smiled. A real smile. The kind he hadn't worn in years. Yes. Sophie hugged him tightly. The audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. Not for a genius. Not for a mathematician. Not even for a man who solved an impossible problem. It was for a father who refused to quit. A man everyone overlooked. A man judged by worn shoes and tired eyes. A man carrying grief, responsibility, and hope all at once. And on the night a professor confidently declared that nobody could solve his challenge, the person who proved him wrong wasn't the smartest student in the room. It was a single father who had spent years solving a far greater equation, the impossible mathematics of love, sacrifice, and survival.